we did in the last class, right? Okay. Now, if you remember in the very last class we had before the break, we started off with this topic called international trade, right? And we said that this is the last topic of Unit 4, which is macroeconomics, right? So what is international trade? Why is that important? And, what benefits countries get out of international trade? So these were some of the things that we discussed. So we'll do a quick recap of what we discussed in the last class and then move forward from there, right? In today's class, we'll talk about absolute advantage and comparative advantage. What are those? Why are those important? All those things we'll talk about in today's class. Okay, but before that, let's do a quick recap. What is international trade? The idea is fairly simple. Whenever two or more countries are trading among themselves, that is international trade, right? So when someone in your country trades with someone else within the same country, then that is not international trade because that is national trade, right? So if someone in, let's say, one city of Pakistan trades with some other business located in another city of Pakistan, that's not international trade, that's national within the borders of a country, right? But when two countries or more countries are involved and they are trading among themselves, that is known as international trade, right? So when Pakistan exports textiles to USA, or when Pakistan imports, let's say, oil from another country, that is international trade, right? Zohan, so we're doing a quick recap of what we did in the last class regarding international trade, and then we'll move forward from there. Okay. Now, why should countries engage in international trade? That's the big question, right? Justification of international trade. Why should countries engage in international trade, or how is that beneficial, right? So think about this. Human needs. Now, we identified two major reasons why countries should engage in international trade. Human needs are ever increasing, and no country has enough resources to produce everything on its own. Now, this is the main point that you need to pay attention to. Not every country, no country in the world technically, can produce everything on its own. Walaikum assalam, Zuhan, how are you? Right? And therefore, it needs to rely on other countries to provide for some goods and services. Now, think about this. Pakistan is primarily agricultural based economy, which means we are good at agricultural goods, but we're not very good at manufactured goods. We're not very good with services. So what we do, we produce agricultural goods, we export the surplus, and in exchange, we get other products that we are not that good in producing. Yes or no, right? So that's one reason why countries engage in international trade, because they cannot produce everything on their own. Are you getting me, right? So there are very few countries in the world which produce oil. Now, oil is something that is used in production of electricity, that is used in, running of factories, to run other things, right? Automobiles and so on and so forth, right? Now, if few countries are producing oil, then does that mean that all other countries do not use vehicles, they do not produce electricity, they do not run their factories? Obviously, that's not possible. So what those countries do, since it's an opportunity for them as well, they export oil, and in exchange, they get all the other products, like they buy with that money. When they sell oil, when they export oil, in exchange of like the money that they earn, with that money, they buy other things that they don't have, or they can't produce, right? Easy. Okay. Another reason why countries engage in international trade is that every country has different factor endowment. If you remember, we did talk about this. What is factor endowment? Factor endowment is the type of resources that you have. What is factor endowment, right? So factor endowments is the type of resources that a country has, right? Now, some countries' resources are more suited towards one type of product, and other countries' resources are more suited towards production of other type of products. So it's automatically, it makes sense for people to, for countries to specialize, right? So instead of trying to produce everything, including things that you're not good at producing, it's better that you focus on things that you're good at producing, produce a surplus, export the surplus, and in exchange get the products that you're not good at producing. Am I making sense to all? Right? Simple example. I can give you 100 of examples we discussed in the last class as well, right? So Pakistan has fertile land, cheap labor. Most of Pakistan's population is located in rural areas, right? Where agriculture happens. So we are able to produce agricultural goods at lower cost compared to other countries relatively, right? And since our agricultural products are cheaper, it totally makes sense for other countries, rather than they try to focus and produce agricultural goods, they buy cheaper agricultural goods from us, and in exchange, they export to us what they can produce cheaply. What they can produce cheaply, right? So China and India are focusing on manufactured goods like phones, laptops, and things like that, because labor is cheap. These are big countries with a lot of land, so rent is cheaper, right? And so on and so forth, right? So they focus on those things, right? And similarly, developed countries, like if we talk about the Western countries like Europe and let's say especially UK and US, right? So they focus on things like services, banking, education, healthcare, and things like that, right? So that's why it's better for countries to engage in international trade. Any confusion so far, students? Anything that's not clear? Anything you want to ask me, right? Then we talked about the benefits of international trade, right? So we said when countries specialize in certain products, they produce larger quantities of those goods and therefore can benefit from economies of scale. Now, what is economies of scale, right? So if you remember, I did show you in the last class, but if there's any confusion, I can show you again, right? So economies of scale is a concept that says that when you produce something in larger quantities, the per unit cost decreases. What is per unit cost? Average cost of producing that thing, right? So when you produce something in larger quantities, the per unit cost of producing that thing decreases, which means that it's costing you less to produce that product. Is this making sense? Is making sense, students, right? Okay, have a look at this, right? So on the y-axis, you will have average total cost. On the x-axis, you will have quantity, right? So on the y-axis of the graph, you have average total cost, right? Which means what's the cost of producing a typical unit of the good. Average ATC, we also call this average total cost. We will discuss cost in more detail when we move to A2. That's part of A2, not of AS, right? But I'll quickly tell you how we calculate average total cost, right? And then on the x-axis of the graph, you have quantity, how much quantity of the good you are producing. Quantity of good, right? Easy. This is making sense, right? Okay. Now the shape of this graph, average total cost graph, is U-shaped, right? So this is the ATC curve, as we say, average total cost curve, right? Now, what we can observe from this, have a look at this, right? So when, let's say, you were operating on point A, right? Let's say the company was producing, this company, whatever this company is producing, let's say this company was producing 100 units or 200 units or whatever, right? So let's say the company was producing 200 units of t-shirts, phones, laptops, could be anything, right? And each cell phone or each shirt, whatever it was costing you, let's say each t-shirt was costing you $10 to produce. That's what average total cost is, how much it costs to produce a typical unit of the good, right? When this company increased its output from 200 t-shirts per day to, let's say, something more, right? Let's say 400 units, right? Then each t-shirt cost dropped from $10 to, let's say, how many dollars? $7 per t-shirt, right? So average total cost of producing that product dropped. Are you getting me, students? Are you following me? So the per unit cost dropped to this. Then you will hit the lowest possible point on the ATC when you produce at this level, which is known as optimum level of output, right? So let's say if the company produces, let's say, something 600 units of t-shirts per day, so your average total cost would be lowest, and that would be, let's say, around $6 each, right? But after this point, what will happen? Your average total cost will start to go up. Your average total cost will start to go up, right? As you can see. So beyond this output level, your average total cost will start to rise up, and this is known as diseconomies of scale. So for the part where it was decreasing, the first half of the graph, that's known as economies of scale, students. When the average total cost is decreasing, that's known as economies of scale. And for the later part, when it starts to go up, it's known as diseconomies of scale. Sorry, just give me a second. So this downward sloping part where your average total cost is coming down up till this part, it's economies of scale, and beyond this part, where it starts to go up, that's known as diseconomies of scale. So let me write this down quickly, and then I'll read your comments. So that's diseconomies of scale. And the first half of the graph is showing you economies of scale, right? Easy. So this was economies. So let's just write this down. There's something wrong with my Writing down economies of scale. Easy, good one. What is J curve? J curve is basically the exchange rate, Marshall-Lerner condition. We'll talk about that. That's a concept related to exchange rate and balance of payments, right? So when we come to the last unit of our AS economics syllabus, that's where we'll learn the J curve, Marshall-Lerner condition, right? So basically J curve, let me give you a quick hint and then we'll discuss in more detail when we reach to that part of the syllabus. So J curve shows the relationship between exchange rate and balance of payments. So that's diseconomies of scale. So we'll talk about that, but to just give you a quick idea, Zuhan is asking us that what's the reason for diseconomies of scale to happen, right? So economies of scale happen. This is part of A2, but I'm just giving you some quick hint. Economies of scale happens due to reasons that when you expand your output, you buy raw material in bulk. When you buy raw material in bulk, what happens? Your average total cost decreases. Similarly, economies of scale happens because when you increase your output, you get discounts from suppliers, and then you get loans on lower interest rates from the banks. Financial economies, we call that financial economies. And when you buy raw material in bulk, you get bulk buying economies of scale, right? Because you're buying in bulk, so per unit cost decreases and so on. So these are some of the reasons. So we are not going in much detail because that's not part of our syllabus, right? So these are the reasons that cause economies of scale. And when we think about diseconomies of scale, the reasons why diseconomies happen, Preet, I'm saying Zohan, is that when you expand beyond a certain level, it becomes too difficult to manage a company, right? And if you take, I don't know if you take business studies or not, you would know that the business structure becomes too complicated, right? It becomes more than complicated, I would say. It becomes too much crowded, right? There are too many layers in the business, right? So there are too many layers, right, in the business, and therefore the cost of operating that business increases a lot. And that's what results in inefficiencies. And that's what causes diseconomies of scale. Is it making sense? Administration cost rise, and exactly, right? Because think about, when a business grows, it starts off with one city in a country, and then it grows into multiple cities of the country, and then it becomes international business, multinational business in multiple cities of different countries, right? Then you have to add additional layers, more levels of management, more layers of managers, and all of those comes at additional cost, and that increases the cost of running that business. And eventually what happens, that your cost goes up and your average total cost of production also increases. Is everyone clear on this? So that's one major benefit of international trade, that when you trade, you produce in larger quantities because you specialize, you focus on few things. When you specialize, you focus on few things, you produce in larger quantities, your average total cost of production decreases, right? So another major benefit of specialization is specializing in products for which a country's factor of production are more suited allows for more efficient use of resources, right? So think about this. If Pakistan tries producing manufactured goods, then it will take us a couple of years before we can be as efficient as countries which have more capital and trained labor force. Are you getting me or not? So it's linking back to this point. So different countries have factors of production that suit production of different type of products. So you need to think, a country needs to think and decide which products is its factors of production more suited for, right? So as I just told you, that Pakistan, mainly an agricultural country, big space, like more space, relatively more uneducated, or you can say less educated workforce, which means it's cheaper. They are available for manual work because agriculture does require manual work. So they are more suited towards production of agricultural goods. Whereas if you think of developed countries where there's more machinery, technology, companies, they are more suited towards manufactured goods or services, right? Okay, so another benefit of international trade is that you earn foreign exchange. As I was mentioning earlier, that when you sell your products, when you export something, in exchange, you earn foreign exchange reserve, and you can use that to buy other things that you can't produce on your own. So Pakistan imports cars, Pakistan imports cell phones, Pakistan imports consumer goods, clothes. So we are able to do that when we export, right? Because otherwise our balance of payments goes in deficit, right? If we are constantly importing more, we are spending foreign exchange, and we're not earning foreign exchange through exports, then our balance of payment goes in deficits. That results in international debt. right? And all those problems that we discussed in balance of payments thing, right? And yes, most important of all, more choice. When you trade, that means that foreign goods are coming to your country. Consumers have more choice. So I can buy local car, locally manufactured car, or I can buy imported car, and so on and so forth, right? So these are some of the benefits of international trade. Easy? Any confusion so far? So if everything is clear so far, students, then we'll move on. And today we'll talk about absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Now, think about this. What are models of international trade? These models explain the pattern of international trade, which means what? International trade refers to the idea that how countries decide which products should they specialize in, right? Okay, think about this. So what's the idea here? What do we mean by pattern of international trade? The pattern of international trade means refers to the idea that countries decide idea of how countries decide which products should they specialize in, right? Are you getting? Now think about this. Which point? Which point you're talking about? This one? This one, Zuhan? Okay, so if this is the one, let me explain you, right? So okay. Now think about this. Let's take a simple example and let's look at this point in the light of that example. Pakistan, China, right? So if Pakistan and China are producing one same product, right? Let's say we are producing clothes, right? So a typical unit of clothing, right? Could be a pair of jeans, could be a t-shirt, could be a shirt, could be anything, right? Let's be more specific. So let's say a typical pair of jeans costs China $10 to produce. The same pair of jeans cost Pakistan $12 to produce. Now, what could be the reasons for that difference? In China, the factory where it's located, China is a bigger country, the land is cheap, the rent is cheap, first thing. China relatively has more advanced machinery to manufacture textiles, and therefore they can produce at lower cost, right? They require less labor, they require less energy, they use less raw material, they waste less raw material, and so on, right? And things like that. So if China can produce that pair of jeans for $12 and Pakistan can produce it for $10, right? So which of the two countries should specialize in that product? Because at the end of the day, from which country would countries import from? If you are sitting in a European country, or if you're sitting in America or in some other country of the world, and you have to decide between importing a pair of jeans from Pakistan and China, which country would you go for? Right? China, because the price is low, because the cost is lower. Yes or no? Right? So that is what I meant. So when Chinese resources are favoring production of manufactured goods and Pakistan's resources are favoring production of agricultural goods, right? What do we mean by favoring? Favoring means that what type of resources you need more in agriculture? Fertile land, cheap labor, yes or no? More rural population, because in urban areas we don't have agricultural lands, we have a rural area, right? So if these are our resources and our resources are supporting agricultural goods, then we should go for agricultural goods. And on the other hand, if China will be more competitive, exactly. And if Chinese resources are favoring production of manufactured goods, then they should go for that. That's what it meant, right? So countries should specialize based on what products their factors of production support. That's the idea. Okay. Now, students, moving on. Is this clear, Zohan? Now, talking about models of international trade. These models explain the pattern of international trade. What do we mean by pattern of international trade? So when I said that China and India are specializing in manufactured goods, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, just giving you an idea, I'm not very sure about all these countries. They are focusing more on agricultural goods. African countries are focusing more on agricultural goods. Europe is more focusing on products like, manufactured goods, and US is focusing more on services and so on. Now, that is what I mean pattern of international trade, that which country will export what and which country will import what. And that's what I mean pattern of international trade. So over time, economists have come up with these two models known as absolute advantage and comparative advantage that explain why a country specializes in the product in which it specializes. Do I make sense? No worries. So pattern of international trade, these models of international trade explain why, let's put it in more simple words, explain why these specialize in products which they specialize, right? That's what it means, right? Okay, now think about this. There are two bases on which countries specialize. Either they specialize on the basis of their absolute advantage, or they specialize on the basis of their comparative advantage. Now, before we jump on to these models, let's talk about some assumptions. So why do we keep assumptions in any model? Why do we keep assumptions? Can anyone of you tell me? So why do we keep assumptions when we talk about absolute or comparative advantage? To earn more revenue as they produce will be more competitive in the national market. To earn more revenue as their products will be more competitive in national markets. Sorry, Zohan, I did not understand. Your last comment is not making much sense. So I was asking you, think about this. So up till now, students, have a look at this. What we have discussed, now we are saying that we are about to discuss models of international trade. Now, models of international trade, which are absolute advantage and comparative advantage, these two models explain why countries specialize in products in which they specialize. So why is Pakistan specializing in agricultural goods? Why is USA specializing in services? Why is UK specializing in cars or blah, 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 whatever, right? So on and so forth, right? So that is what these models will explain. Now, before we jump on to discussing these models, what we need to discuss is their assumptions. What do we need to discuss? Their assumptions. Now, my question to you was that why do we make assumptions whenever there is any model in economics, right? Oftentimes you will see that there are some assumptions we are making. So why we make assumptions, right? Yes or no? Is it making sense or not? Is it too difficult to comprehend? Okay, now students, think about this. In real life, in real world, how many countries there are in the world? Approximately. I mean, there's always a margin. I get what you're trying to say, Zohan, but the reason is, think about this. Reality is always much more complicated. Reality is much, think about this. Let's put it in simple words. Let's say you skipped your exam. You skipped your exam, right? You have to go tomorrow to school and you have to give an explanation to your teacher that why were you missing. Easy, simple, daily life issue, right? Now you make some assumptions based on your assessment of the teacher. So sometimes you will say that since the teacher is lenient, I can just honestly tell the teacher I was not very well prepared and I will do a retake or something else, right? But if you think that the teacher is really strict and the teacher can make a big fuss out of it, then you can go and you can tell a complete lie that something bad happened, my XYZD was in hospital, I was in the hospital, or I was not feeling well, and so on. So this is based on the assumption. Exactly. It is because it may not always be right. Yeah. And it is trying to simplify a situation, right? Because you cannot always predict that if you come to my class and I'm your teacher, and if you say something to me, how will I react? But based on our previous interactions, you have some understanding, you have some assumption. So reality is very complicated, but we can't capture all the complications in a model. So model is a simplified version of reality. How many of you are making sense? Are you getting me or not? Therefore, right? This is making sense, right? So economic models or any models in any subject that you study, even in science, right? When you do an experiment, you do hold something constant to see what's happening, right? So you make some assumptions so that you can predict the result, right? Because in real life, things are very complicated. There are a lot of things that can affect something, right? But in model, you make some assumptions, you assume some things to be true, you assume some things to be not true, so that you can simplify that thing, right? Now, let me give you some examples and you will understand yourself. There are, in these two models, we'll assume that there are only two countries which are trading among themselves. Now, this is a very, unrealistic assumption, as we say, right? Because in real world, how many countries there are? There are more than 170 countries in the world, right? And oftentimes, in fact, every time, each country is trying to kind of trying to trade with every other country in the world, right? So just imagine how many possible trade options there are, right? Pakistan with India, India with China, China with USA, USA with Pakistan, and so on and so forth, right? But for the sake of simplicity, because we can't account for all these, possibilities, so we are assuming that in absolute and comparative advantage model that we are about to look at, we'll assume that there are only two countries that are trading among themselves. Then another thing that we are assuming, which is not very realistic, there are only two products that these countries produce, right? So there are only two products that these countries produce, right? Again, that's a very unrealistic assumption, because in real life, we do know that countries produce hundreds of products, right? Hundreds of different products, right? 195 countries in the world, right? Great, right? So countries produce hundreds of products, but here we are assuming that these countries are only producing two products, right? The vectors of production fixed certain time, right? Again, now we are assuming that during a certain point in time, the factors of production of these countries is fixed, right? What do we mean by that? Pakistan, if Pakistan has certain area of fertile agricultural land, if Pakistan has, let's say, 1,000 square kilometer of fertile land, then we will assume that to be true, right? So we'll assume that neither that is increasing nor that is decreasing, so that is staying constant. This is making sense, right? The factors of production of each country are fixed during a certain time period, right? Is this making sense, right? Is this good? And And the fourth and the last assumption that we're making over here is that there is no use of currency for international trade, and countries use the barter system for exchange of goods and services. Right? This is making sense, right? Because what happens in real life? In real life, there are always currencies involved, right? Right? When Pakistan exports something, most of the times Pakistan is collecting that revenue in rupees or perhaps dollars, because dollar is a bigger currency, and most countries in the world use dollars, right? But here we are making this assumption that we are not using currencies for trade. Instead, we are exchanging goods and services for the goods and services. It's a barter system, right? Now, how many of you are absolutely clear on what we are doing over here? For the sake of simplicity, we make assumptions, right? Because real life or reality is very complicated, right? So we try to predict, we try to explain a more complicated scenario with some assumptions through the help of a model, right? Now, what are the assumptions that we're making for the absolute advantage and comparative advantage? That there are only two countries in the world, they only produce two products, the factors of production are fixed during certain time period, and there's no use of currency, and instead countries are using the barter system to exchange, to buy goods and services and whatever, right? Easy. We're good on this. Okay, now have a look at this. Now, what is absolute advantage? Did we discuss this in the last class? So absolute advantage is a country something, or right? This is making sense. Now, what is absolute advantage? Students, think about this. So absolute advantage is when a country can produce something at lower cost or in larger quantities, right? Then that is when it's said to have absolute advantage, right? And one more assumption that I completely forgot. The opportunity cost producing the two products right? Have a look at this. So the opportunity cost of producing the two products is always fixed, right? Between these, for the two countries, right? Now, what do we mean by opportunity cost is fixed, right? Or constant? Now, if you remember, let me give you an example here and that will help you better understand. When we discussed in the very first unit of AS economics, if you remember, we talked about this concept called production possibility curve. Do you remember or have you forgotten? So what is production possibility curve? PPC, the short form of production possibility curve, is basically, it says it's a graph that shows how much output a country can produce with available amount of, how much output can a country produce with available amount of resources. This is making sense, right? Now, in that, we discussed that either your production possibility curve will be a straight downward sloping line, either your production possibility curve will be a straight downward sloping line, or it will be a curve bending towards the origin. Do you remember? Right? Now, what was the difference between these two PPC curves, right? Now, the difference between these two PPC curves is that if it's a straight horizontal line, if it's a straight horizontal line, just a second. Right. So if it's a straight horizontal line, not sorry, horizontal, if it's a straight downward sloping line, if the PPC of a country, it's a straight downward sloping line, it means that the opportunity cost is constant. That to produce one more unit of the good on the x-axis, you always have to give up the same units of the good on the y-axis. I repeat, if the production possibility curve of an economy is a straight downward sloping line, it means that the opportunity cost between these two products that we are listing on the PPC are constant, which means that to produce one more unit of car, you always need to give up the same units of phone. To produce more units of cars, you always need to give up same units of phones, right? But if your production possibility curve is a curve, which means it's, bending outwards, right? So then it shows that the opportunity cost between producing these products is increasing opportunity cost. You remember we talked about that. In this case, it's constant opportunity cost. And in the other case, it's increasing opportunity cost. Is there any confusion so far, students? Constant opportunity cost, I just explained you, that means that to produce one more unit of car, you always have to, opportunity cost, you always have to give up same units of phone, right? Whenever you have to produce one more unit of cars, let's say in this case, you might always be giving up on 2 units of phones or 3 units of phones. So that means constant, right? Whereas in this case, when it's a curve, when the PPC is a curve, that is increasing opportunity cost, which means to produce one additional unit of car, you have to give up more and more units. As you start producing more units of cars, you have to give up increasing opportunity cost. You have to give up more units of phone, right? You have to give up more units of phone, right? This is making sense. Okay. Now, in this case, we are assuming that it's a constant opportunity cost. So it will be a straight down sloping curve. Okay. Now let's talk about absolute advantage, students, right? So absolute advantage, as I just mentioned, is when a country can produce something with lower cost, when a country can produce something with lower cost or in larger quantities. That's absolute advantage. This is making sense. So let's assume any two products. Let's stick to the same two products that we were talking about, right? So we are looking at how many units of phones a country can produce and how many units of cars a country can produce, right? So let's say you have Pakistan. I mean, we can take the name or we can just keep the name anonymous, right? So let's say you have country A and you have country B, right? I'm just filling out the information, and then with this information, I'll make the PPC, right? Okay, now think about this, students. Let's assume country A can produce 1,000 cars if it allocates all of its resources towards production of cars, and it can produce 2,000 phones, right? If it allocates all of its resources towards production of phones. Country B, on the other hand, can produce 800 units of cars if it allocates all of its resources towards production of cars. And it can produce 300 units of phones if it allocates all of its resources towards production of phones. Now, what you have to do, you have to simply construct their production possibility curves on the same graph, right? You have to construct their production possibility curves on the same graph. So let's first make it for, any one of the two countries, let's say country A, right? So on the y-axis, you can take any of the two products. Let's say we are taking phones on the y-axis and we're taking cars on the x-axis. Any confusion, students? Is there any confusion? So what I'm doing, this information was provided to me. All I'm doing, I'm constructing production possibility curve with this information. So country A was able to produce 1,000 cars and 2,000 phones. 1,000 cars, right? So if it allocates all of its resources towards production of cars, how many cars can country A produce? How many cars can country A produce? 1,000, right? And if it allocates all of its resources towards production of phones, what's the maximum quantity of phones it can produce? Let's say 2,000. Any confusion so far? Right? Now, similarly, we'll construct the production possibility curve for the other country. Right? We are constructing the production possibility curve for country B. Now, for country B, we do know, right? For country B, we do know that country B is able to produce 800 units of cars, right? 800 units of cars. So that's what it shows on the x-axis, and it can produce 300 units of phones. Any confusion so far, students? Is everyone clear on this? So this is country B, right? Okay. Now this information, you might not always be given the table. Most of the times on the MCQs, you're giving a production possibility curve like the one I've made below, right? Now, just by looking at the production possibility curve, you can tell that which country has absolute advantage in which product. I repeat. Sometimes you're not provided this table, right? Which means that you don't have to construct the production possibility curve on your own, and instead you are just given the production possibility curves directly. Just by looking at these production possibility curves, you can tell that which country has absolute advantage in which product. Am I making sense or not? Right? So if you compare production of phones, which country can produce more phones? Country B is good with phones because it can produce. That's what the definition of production possible absolute advantage is. If a country can produce something at lower cost or in larger quantities, that's what shows that the country has, absolute advantage. So country B has absolute advantage since it can produce more units of phones, so it has absolute advantage in phones. And since country A can produce more units of cars, so country A has absolute advantage in cars. Any confusion? Anything that's not clear? That was very simple and easy, but it gets a little complicated. Now, if we assume that one of the two countries can produce more of both the goods, if we assume that one of the two countries can produce more units of both the goods, then in that case, what should they do? Should they not trade? Okay. Now, what I mean over here, students, think about this. So if one of the two countries can produce more units of both the products. Now, what I mean over here, let's say one country's production possibility curve is this, and the other country's production possibility curve is this, right? So think about this. Let's say this is for country B, right? And the inner one is for country A, right? Now, we are taking the same two products as we were in the last example, right? So you have quantities of phones on the y-axis, and then you have quantities of cars on the x-axis, right? So if one of the two countries, it is totally possible that one of the two countries is so big, let's say China versus Sri Lanka, right? So China is a way bigger country than Sri Lanka, and therefore China can produce. Yeah, we are coming to that, Zohan, just give me a second. So if China, being a much bigger country than Sri Lanka, right, can produce more units of phones and more units of cars. Now, this puts us in a difficult situation. Why? Because then does that mean that the other country, let's say Sri Lanka in this case, it should not produce anything? Then if Sri Lanka is not producing anything, then what does it mean? Sri Lanka just sits there, not produce anything and buy everything from China? I mean, so technically, when this thing happens, it means that absolute advantage has failed. I repeat myself. So this is a little tricky, but I would want you to understand. So when one country is bigger and it can produce more units of both the things, then technically absolute advantage has failed, because then it means that this country should produce both the products. But then what does it mean for the other country? That it should not use its resources and buy both the products from country B, but that would be complete waste of its resources for country A, right? So country A can't sit idle and not produce anything. So then what actually happens, that when absolute advantage fails, that is when comparative advantage comes into picture. And comparative advantage predicts the pattern of international trade. How? We'll talk about that in tomorrow's class. Students, is everyone clear on this? Any confusion so far? Anything that anyone was not able to understand? So we understood what absolute advantage was. Comparative advantage, we said when absolute advantage fails, we'll talk about comparative advantage tomorrow. There are some calculations involved, and we'll see how then countries decide which product to specialize in. Right? Again, we will see that B will only specialize in one products. It's even though it can produce more of both the goods, but comparative advantage says that it should still specialize in only one of the two goods so that the other country can produce the other thing. Got it? Right? So students will stop here for today, and tomorrow we'll pick up from here. Right. I'll reply